Hi everyone, I'm Mandana Javaheri, the Head of Security Business at Microsoft. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your continuous commitment and trust in Microsoft. I was checking our registration list and it was so good to see so many familiar names across the industry, both from our customer and partner organizations globally. Welcome to our Airlift, which covers our latest investments in security and how they contribute to advancing our Zero Trust framework and multi-cloud strategies. As you know, we acquired two cutting-edge technologies last year, CloudKnox and RiskIQ, and currently we are in the process of embedding these technologies into our platform. CloudKnox, Microsoft Keem, Cloud Identity Entitlement Management, is a unified permissions management platform with patented activity-based authorization technology. It understands risk profile, does detailed usage analysis, removes unused and excessive permissions, and finally it enforces just-in-time access permission on demand. And RiskIQ focuses on two main areas: threat intelligence to evict attackers faster with deep insight into attacker infrastructure, as well as EASM, external attack surface management, to protect multi-cloud and hybrid environments. So RiskIQ provides complete, continuous discovery of all internet-facing assets for your organizations. It identifies critical exposed attack surface risk and unmanaged assets in order to prioritize risk and validate control. It also automates and infuses existing security solutions and other digital programs with asset intelligence. You're the first audience who will get visibility into our plans, the additional benefits these capabilities and technologies provide, how we will be embedding them into our platform and our roadmap. Hope you enjoy the next couple of days with us and find this Airlift valuable. If you're a customer, please feel free to reach out to us to get more information about these technologies and request a live demo. And if you are a partner, please reach out to our security partner development team after this Airlift, and they will be more than happy to help you build your practice on these new solutions to help our mutual customers. Thanks again and enjoy the Airlift.
Thank you, Mandana. Great to see you again. Hi, I'm Richard Diver, Senior Technical Business Development Manager on the Security Partner Development Team, and I've had the pleasure of working with the experts at both RiskIQ and CloudKnox as they transition into Microsoft. I'll be your host for the next 3 days of these events, and next we're going to have Mark Simos, who's going to talk us through the updates to the Zero Trust framework and what that means for the next couple of days. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks. So, Mark Simos, I go by Lead Cybersecurity Architect at Microsoft. Information there on where to find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. So I spend my days kind of looking at the world through the lens of various different security roles at our customers, CISO, CIO, technical directors, technical managers, security analysts, SOC analysts, engineers, architects, sometimes even business leaders, and looking at the challenges that these roles face with modernizing and transforming security using a zero trust approach, as well as Microsoft's portfolio and how that helps of capabilities. And so we're kind of doing a bit of a tour over that today, and then we'll go ahead and dive in and kind of call out where some of these new members of Microsoft's family, RiskIQ and CloudKnox, respectively, where they fit in and how they fit into this sort of modern zero trust strategy. So first, we'll set a little context on this zero trust transformation. I tend to like the term transformation better than journey because we're not really tourists on a boat going, hey, that looks nice, and then going back to our lives, we're actually changing the way we do things. And so, kind of set some context there of what's changing and how. A privilege access and privilege creep, which is a increasing problem with cloud infrastructure across AWS, Azure, even on-prem with VMware and GCP as well. So how do we make sure we're kind of reining this in as we get to this new platform? And then security intelligence posture management, which is really where Risk IQ has a lot of strengths and helps enable and empower a lot of the other capabilities and provide some new perspectives and new capabilities as well. And then transforming security incrementally and urgently. So again, this is a transformation. We're not going to do it all in one day, but we need to be making progress each day. What's that old expression? Rome wasn't built in a day, but they were working on it every day. So, ultimately, let's set some big picture context here. So the availability of what we now call cloud technology, through things like Netflix and Amazon and all these other Uber and other, kind of classic disruption technology-based companies, they aren't necessarily technology companies, really changed consumers' expectations and when they would get information and products and services and support. And people are expecting things to be different from their governments, from their different from the different stores that they go to and retailers and brands, etc. And so this is driving digital transformation in business as organizations rush to kind of capture these new markets, these new versions of markets. And so in order to do that and to be able to change, they need new technology platforms that are based on this similar same technology platform. So essentially cloud technology. So this is driving the cloud transformation of businesses. And of course, security, the attackers were already attacking all of the existing stuff, and now they're starting to attack these new platforms as well. And they're finding that as people rush to market, there tend to be a little bit higher levels of vulnerabilities, sometimes a lot higher. But this is creating a pressure on security from two different directions, where the platforms that we have to secure and the assets and the data and the systems and the apps, the nature of them is changing, the architecture is changing at the same time as the attackers are hitting these things and much more intensely, as well as using some of this newer technology themselves to improve their attacks, and of course just generally improving their attacks and monetization. So all of these are putting an incredible pressure on security to transform. Now, it's really important to remember that this transformation, goes by different names, has different angles. It's roughly, in common between these three organizations, or these different parts of an organization. Digital is the business folks, trying to figure out how to capture these new markets with the technology. The cloud transformation is the technology people supporting that and, adopting and learning how to govern and patch and maintain and update and scale out, these cloud platforms and the new technologies and the developer languages, etc. And then simultaneously, there's this zero trust transformation going on in security that is transforming how security secures all that stuff, looks at the new risks, advises business so that and technology teams so that they don't create risks they don't want to, etc. And one of the key things we found for organizations, whether they figure this out early or late, everyone eventually will figure this out, is everyone's transforming. Everyone needs to work together as a team. And so the organizations that do well are the ones that actually work together as a team, and the security and the technology and the business people get to know each other, get to understand the challenges that they're working on, because nobody's got a 3-year plan that they're working back from. Yeah, maybe you have some high-level goals, but the reality is things are changing so fluidly in the market that everything is changing. So it's really important to remember that there's good people in all of these things that are working together. These aren't your enemies. The enemies are actually the attackers. And so, the more that we work together, the more that you're effective, and the more that your job is actually enjoyable and fun, we found. So let's dive into this zero trust transformation just a bit more. Ultimately, what this actually instantiates at for most of the folks in the security organization is a zero trust security strategy. And we want to be very specific here that there's really kind of two different perceptions on what zero trust is, arguably three. One is the position that Microsoft agrees with, which is that it's an end-to-end strategy that's transforming pretty much everything in security. There's another sort of perception of it, which is basically where zero trust began, and so it's really understandable why people are thinking that's all zero trust is that it's relooking at identity and access. And so that access space, whether it's, this is where the 2 versus 3 comes in, whether it's an identity access and, hey, identity is a new perimeter type of view, which, it has a valid perspective, or the, hey, we're going to update our network access and it's transforming the way we do network access, which is also a valid perspective at the same time. But either way, we see some folks think that it's just about access control. And that's also where SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, fits in. Just a little bit more of like a specific reference architecture, a prescriptive way of dealing with one particular part of access, which is all the different points of the edge, of the technical estate, service edge, as Gartner calls it. And so but ultimately, zero trust, we found that those same things that are transforming, hey, the perimeter isn't cutting it as these, devices and cloud apps and everything else outside of our network, outside of our network control. How do we go ahead and provide protections there? And so that's, the absolute first and most important part of zero trust. But the same things driving that are also driving a need to do detection, monitoring, response outside of that traditional network perimeter, as well as deal with the attacks that get past it on the inside and do lateral traversal. So it's really important to understand that this same set of forces is also modernizing infrastructure development, the way you think about protecting data, because the entire technical estate itself is changing, and of course IoT and OT as well. A little bit less on the specific controls. You don't really have oftentimes OAuth and OIDC and SAML, et cetera, and all these kind of modern controls in the IoT and OT space. You're often relying a little heavier on network controls and network sensors and tap and span port and analysis types of approaches. But ultimately, the same principles are driving across all of these, and that spans every technology: identity, endpoint, network, application, infra, data, etc. So let's dive into those principles that I mentioned. So the principles that are driving this there's 3 that Microsoft has defined. There's a few others out there. I'm actually a Zero Trust architecture co-chair at the Open Group, where there's a set of Zero Trust commandments that updated the original Jericho commandments. And so there's a couple different perspectives out there. Microsoft centers on these 3, and we'll kind of explain them and why. So assume breach or assume compromise is basically fairly simple, and this is the big shift, which is that attackers can and will successfully attack something in your environment. That's just basically the assumption, because it's essentially an open network. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Verify explicitly is about making sure that you're actually doing explicit validation of trust, that you're not simply assuming trust. Oh, it's on the network, it's safe. No, we're not doing that anymore. And then least privilege access. Now, all that security stuff is great, but it has to be balanced with all of the other things that are driving that digital transformation. We need to make sure the organization is agile, the things that are happening are sustainable, and that the user experience is simple and easy, not only for security and for IT admins, et cetera, but also for end users. We need to make sure we're doing that, because if you crank down too tight on the security, then people will just go ahead and go around the controls, because they have that option nowadays. So really important to be thinking through this balance all the time. Sometimes you can get both with the same control, things like passwordless, well done MFA that doesn't prompt you every time, but prompts you only when you change to a new device or a new location. So there's great ways of doing MFA's multi-factor authentication. And there's great ways of getting both through some controls, and sometimes you have to make a choice. So very important to keep that balance in mind at all times. Now, let's take a look first at assume breach or assume compromise. This is sort of the granddaddy or grandma or godfather, godmother. This is the big assumption that shifts thinking from assuming a safe network to assuming an open network. And what that causes us to do is look at the world not through, inside or outside of the box, or inside or outside of the network, but let's look at the individual entities on it. It's harder work, but it ends up making you much more secure, much more flexible by looking at it this way. And so we use this sort of graph thinking to illustrate this. So if you look, you've got those nodes, the assets, they show up as different things: users, apps, device, data, APIs, you name it. And then, some of them have control relationships to the other ones. And the attackers use those. Phish a user, get access to the things they can access. Okay, then they use that to take control of one of those things and then see what that can access, and on down the line. And so you have to sort of look at the world through that lens to be able to do that on this sort of open network thing. And just as a point of clarification, we don't advocate for simply shutting down firewalls. We know we have legacy apps. We know legacy architectures. We want to make sure that we're still filtering the inbound traffic. We're still doing basic segmentation, basic inspection, et cetera. And there's some NetFlow things you can do with NDR that are kind of cool. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're not assuming that that is the only thing we have to do. We're actually looking within that environment, and we're looking outside of that network in this graph way. Let's take a look at each individual node, and this is where verify explicitly comes in. Obviously, you need scalable solutions like Azure AD, conditional access, and others to sort of do this at scale. But what you're doing is fundamentally for each node, making sure that you're limiting what can control this to only the things that should have control of that. And this is ultimately, going back to an older term, attack surface. This is the attack surface of each individual asset. And the last principle of least privilege is the other part of the relationship, which is what can this control and how do we remove or limit those, because there's no reason for this particular account to have control over those systems. It's a business risk and it doesn't actually get used in any business process. So let's take that away. So that's a classic definition of least privilege. There's another element of it that's come into favor over the past 5 to 10 years that people have figured out, is the just-in-time access, which is things like privilege access management, privilege identity management, and also the cloud infrastructure entitlement management, or KIM, that CloudKnox provides. And the idea is that you're getting permissions on demand. You're getting privileges on demand rather than having them on your account at all times, even when you don't need them, because that only helps the attacker. It doesn't actually help you. And then all this pretty much nets out to being blast radius. So if something is compromised or lost, limits the blast radius of what can be damaged from that asset. We have a fairly detailed rapid modernization plan for Zero Trust overall, end-to-end, across all these common initiatives around securing identities and access, data, SecOps, etc. We're not going to go over that today. That is published in the Cyber Reference Architecture, that first link there on the top right. And then the documents for it were in the midst of publishing. I think we've got the first 2 initiatives published so far that you can go to there with that second URL. So a couple areas we wanted to highlight just to show the context of where CloudKnox and RiskIQ fit in. CloudKnox really helps with 2 different areas. The first is privileged access, which is a portion of securing your identities and access. It's the high impact important ones, specifically the ones related to infrastructure. And so it really helps with posture management and privilege creep in particular, which is you're using a lot more, you're giving away a lot more privileges to your infrastructure than people are actually using. And so how do you find that, discover it, correct it? And we'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. Shifting to RiskIQ and the way that approaches, there's really 2 different things that focuses on. So security posture, which is essentially the sum total of how well defended you are, how well your controls are in place, preventive, detective, etc. And so, there's a lot of tools like Defender for Cloud and Secure Score that we already have that help you with that. What RiskIQ does is it gives you an outside-in view, not an inside-out view, of external attack surface management, or EASM. And so that's taking an outside-in view from the internet, and where are the places from that outside view that the attackers could get in? What are the things that you might have missed with your internal management tooling, etc. And then RiskIQ also focuses heavily on using that same data for threat intelligence. So how do we make sure that we're enabling and empowering all these different things, as well as helping grow your security threat intelligence program? So we'll cover a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, one of the things I wanted to cover real quick, because governance is a huge sort of keystone of how all this comes together. And I know there's some groaning out there, governance, I hate it. It's one of the least interesting parts of security, but it's also one of the most important ones. We always complain about patches. We always complain about, misconfigurations, etc. Well, what's going to fix that? Rigorous application, consistent application, which is governance. So let's take a moment and set the context of a whole security program fairly quickly. It's all about the assets. We've got to protect the assets. That is what matters. The business assets, ask your business leaders if you're at the sort of position to do that. What are the things that if your entire environment shut down tomorrow, every operation shut down, what's the first thing you need to start up? Is it the factories? Is it the payment systems? Is it the website? What would have to be set up to get the core basics of the business going? It's a great way to start that conversation. And then, of course, you need to translate those into the technical assets, into the specific technical elements that enable that website to work, that let the factory work and coordinate with the people that are driving the trucks that are going to go pick up the product, etc. So ultimately, it's about the assets, but recognizing that assets look different depending on where you are in the organization. Now, of course, you need to use those every day to operate. So you've got to access the assets, and you've got to change them, change the apps, change the processes, change the technology, install new apps and services and APIs to be able to keep up with the digital transformation. So the security elements of that are access control, first and foremost. That's the big one when you realize, hey, the perimeter isn't cutting it anymore because stuff is outside of it and attackers are getting in pretty reliably. Access control is one of the most important things to catch up on first. Innovation security tends to be the second one, or one of the key ones, to make sure that as you go and build these new assets, new APIs, new apps, and do the DevOps, DevSecOps stuff, that security is baked in, is included, because you don't want to be shipping new brownfield. You want to make sure that the new stuff you're creating is at the current security standards of the organization. So really important to get that in place so you're not creating more problems every day that code is written. That's not a good thing. Security operations is, just recognition that the attackers are attacking all the time. You've got to have people detecting, responding, and recovering to those attacks. And then governance. So governance is really what shifts the organization from that sort of static, we've got a firewall, we're good type of approach, to a dynamic, changing, continuous improvement, agile organization. Threw a few keywords in there, but there's a lot of different ways of describing the same thing where you're just incrementally improving every day. This includes intelligence. This includes architecture. This includes policies and standards. This includes posture management. So the intelligence is to inform everyone of what's happening, what are the top attacks, so they can prioritize appropriately, depending on whether building defenses, planning on detections as doing refinements in security operations, whether we need to advise the IT architects to do things a little differently, work with DevOps teams, etc. The more that we know what's happening out there to us, to our industry peers, and to others with the current attacks and the trends, the more that we can actually do things better. Architecture, we need a clear end state. We need to know what stuff looks like and how all these things fit together. Without that architecture, then you're not going to be very good at governance. And so it's sort of the inspirational, cool part of governance. Policies and standards, everybody's favorite part of governance, right? But that's the rule book. That's what helps make sure that our lessons learned, the best practices, are spread throughout the organization and that they're held consistently. This becomes a very dynamic thing. And the illustration for this is Microsoft. When in our IT organization, the way we do policies and standards, it's not just security, it's all cloud policies and standards, including security, is 2-week sprints. So every 2 weeks, the team is meeting and refining the rules and what do we need to work on, what do we need to get clarity on, what's trending in a bad direction based on the intelligence and other things and the architectures that are getting updated, and what do we need to make sure the rules are updated on and tweak and refine so that we're constantly improving the organization and then going out and discovering it, etc. And that discovering it is where the posture management kicks in. How are we doing against this? We have this real-time data from the cloud, and the cloud services are starting to be able to pull it now. Things like Defender for Cloud from not only all the different clouds and Azure, AWS, GCP, but also from on-prem infrastructure as well. And of course, Office 365 and beyond as well. But we can actually start to get this real-time data We've always wanted continuous improvement. We've always asked for it. Now we got it. What do we do with it? Well, you got to have someone watch it and, keep an eye on it and see how the trends are going. And then you got to have someone to work with the teams, DevOps teams, IT ops teams, to actually help fix it. And so that's where posture management kicks in. It's a really, really important perspective there. And so you have that sort of inside out view, things like Defender for Cloud, or I think Palo Alto Prisma Cloud, and there's a few others that do that kind of cloud security posture management. But then you also want the external attack surface management for that inside out view, or excuse me, outside in view. So when we kind of define this in a little bit more detail, your architecture there, sort of that center of gravity, this is where we're going to, this is our destination, that target. Risk and compliance, keeping you aligned to the organization. Security intelligence combines not only what we've learned from our own attacks, so that's from the security operations, the kind of a strategic view of the threat intelligence, not a bunch of IOCs and file hashes, but let's summarize the attack in 3 or 4 steps. Very simply, that can help inform the organization, from business leaders to tech leaders to IT architects, DevOps, IT ops. Like, this is what's happening to us. This is what's happening to our industry peers. This is what's happening to in the world at large. Combined with our business context and intelligence, that becomes then actionable security intelligence we can use. And then, of course, we've got to fix the problems. We've got to actually monitor them. We've got to enable these teams to be successful at it. And then those teams, it's posture management. And then the security maintenance has to be done. Someone's got to patch it. Someone's got to make the configurations, make the updates, add it to the infrastructure as code, and Terraform and ARM and Bicep, automation, etc. And so you really have to have that coordinated approach to make sure those preventive controls are being put in place. So when we look at the infrastructure space, ultimately the way this breaks out is there's shared infrastructure, the underlying cloud tenants and subscriptions and the VMware vSphere instances and Hyper-V and physical servers and all that. There's like this shared infrastructure layer that's managed by typically IT operations in most cases. And then at the per workload level, there's kind of 2 levels. There's a workload infrastructure, and then you have 2 different kinds of workloads. You have the DevOps, sort of ongoing, being maintained, being updated, changing the infrastructure, the containers, the apps, etc. And then you have your existing legacy workloads, which are either something that had that going on, but they kind of stopped, kind of the abandoned apps, but also the commercial applications, and really everything else falls into that bucket. And everything in blue tends to fall onto the IT ops and infrastructure teams in most cases to maintain and secure. And the dynamics that you end up having to deal with are the enterprise-wide, like what do we do across the entire enterprise that is broad-based for everything, right? And you want to have as much secure infrastructure for your kind of classic stuff, as well as the new infra as code, Terraform, ARM, Bicep, kind of new things. Then you're going to need to have slightly different strategy for that per workload for those legacy, maintenance, commercial, abandoned type of applications. How do we keep those workloads secure and going, within the constraints that we have, which are often quite significant. No patches available, etc. Sometimes it's just, hey, we need to apply a patch from XYZ vendor. And then per workload. So this is the DevOps, DevSecOps, currently maintained. There's a dev team there. They care about the application. We just have to help them care about security. So that's kind of the space, the problem space that we have to deal with there. And CloudKnox is really focused on how do we do that for those cloud infrastructures. And then we're also looking at continuing on with the on-prem and so that cross-cloud hybrid multi-cloud approach there. But right now focused first on cloud because we're seeing that permission sprawl, that permission creep really growing in that space. Now, the other aspect of the sort of the way that CloudKnox approaches it, and one of the most important parts of security, is access control, specifically privilege access control. If you lose one particular user, you lose all, if they're compromised by an adversary, they get their credentials and are able to use their account, then they can access all the data the user can access, which is often somewhat significant. But if you lose an admin, you lose all of the data associated in the systems with all of the users that admin can control and all the systems that admin can control. And so the impact that you have is much, much higher for an admin. So we built some privilege access guidance. We'll be adding CloudKnox to it in the near future, but this is sort of the first preview of how that is going to fit in there. But we built this privilege access guidance on how to deal with this. And so starting with enterprise security, your whole point here is you want to increase attacker costs. So you want to have a good, strong baseline for every device, user, intermediary, et cetera, within the system. Then you want to have an elevated one because you do have some productivity users that still have a huge impact. So someone has a Swift terminal for doing financial and bank transactions. If someone works on ERP and CRM systems and they have administration over all the information, any other high impact stuff, developers that are developing business critical apps, all of them need to have both, browsers and email and communications and collaboration, but they also need to have a higher level of security that increases the cost of an attacker to compromise that. That's attacker cost. And then privileged access, which is the highest level one, where we're willing to take a hit on productivity for things like domain admins, global admins, enterprise admins. So we want to make sure that we have a specific defined prescriptive level for that. And all this is documented publicly. That link shows up in just a moment, if I recall correctly. And yep, there it is. And so that sets the baseline system. It crosses devices, accounts, intermediaries, interface, the whole end-to-end session security. But you also need to sustain that over time. You need to make sure that that system will be successful. We don't want to set up the perfect system. I'm thinking of the original Matrix movie. We set up the first, when the architect in the white suit, it's like we set the perfect system up, and quite naturally it failed perfectly, or something like that. We want to make sure that this is a real system that works, that sustains, so we want to make sure we're paying attention to productivity, so that as we go and we work on these different things, that we set these defaults for these configurations, so that we're minimizing the impact on productivity. We're increasing security without impacting the user as much as possible. And then, of course, with the privileged security, you do have to often cut into productivity, but you want to limit that as much as possible. The other thing is hearts and minds. There are people using these things. There are people using these credentials and privileges. And if you don't have them on board, they're going to fight you and they're going to work around you. And so you need to make sure you're focused on buy-in. And that buy-in requires, I know what you're trying to have me do. I'm not confused about that. If I'm confused about it, I'm not going to help because I don't know what you're trying to do. Second is, why do I care? Why is this important to me? I'm paid to do something else. So you need to go do your security stuff, right? And so we have to connect with them and put in their language of why this change that we're proposing, which they understand, is actually important and why they should care. And then, of course, how. If they don't know how to do it, okay, this is important. I know what you're asking, but I have no idea how to do it, dude. You've got to explain it. You've got to give me some instructions. You've got to put it in my language so I understand. If you do this, you have a much higher chance of success of these kind of things. And this is true for admins, for developers, for users in your organization. So you have to touch the hearts and minds and help people. And then another key component of this is really that maintenance and making sure that these things and these principles are kept over time. A key element of which is what CloudKnox invested in and Microsoft recently acquired because of some great technology. And that is addressing privilege creep. There's a difference between what permissions are granted and given out for the different cloud platforms, etc. And this is true of everything. This is not an Azure problem or an AWS problem. This is an everything problem. But the difference between permissions used and permissions granted goes up over time, especially in the cloud because there's so much development, so much new things going up there, keeps going up. But the permissions that are actually used on a day-to-day basis, we found, are ridiculously small. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere between like 1% to 5%, if I recall correctly. So the level of this problem, the amount of permissions that are sitting there latent, that are an opportunity for the attacker, but not actually useful for us as an organization or as the people that are doing the admin work, that gap is painful. And so we need to work on measuring that, finding that, and shutting that down. And so that's what you're going to hear about a lot more with the CloudKnox technology coming up. So switching gears for a bit, threat intelligence. Ultimately, intelligence is not just IOCs and file hashes, indicators of compromise, file hashes, bad IPs, etc. Threat intelligence is an entire set of ambient information that helps everyone make decisions and helps all of our systems make better decisions. So there's really two use cases for threat intelligence. One is the computers, the automated processes for both detection, response, kind of that reactive side, as well as the preventive controls for the protection piece. So all of these things should be informed by threat intelligence as much as possible. Just like machine learning, you have to apply it in a way that's actually helpful for those specific controls and processes. So it's not just a magic peanut butter that you spread over the thing, but it's something that you have available that you integrate at the right points. And Microsoft's done a lot of that work for you with our tool sets. We're constantly looking for the right places to integrate different context and different threat intelligence to keep things relevant to the immediate threats at hand. But threat intelligence is also for humans. Humans make decisions that affect security. From technology practitioners like your SOC analyst, pretty obvious. Your security engineers that are trying to design the right defenses and figure out, are we going to focus our 2 people on the team on patching this month, or are we going to focus them on configuring baselines, right? Like without the context of what attacks are trending in the SOC and security operations and what attacks are, emerging out there in the world that might hit us, Log4j, et cetera, we can't prioritize their time and effort and resources well, and skill sets and training and all those kind of things. So we really need to make sure that those technology practitioners, the architects, the technology leaders, and even business leaders are aware of this. So we're not, hey, we just found out that there's a whole bunch of compromises of these types of apps out there. Let's make sure we're putting some extra static analysis in all of our DevOps processes and bump that up a notch. And making that a priority, we need to be able to make that case to business leaders so that they can say, hey, DevOps teams, y'all need to listen and add some of the security to your stuff. So we need to be able to communicate to all of these people and inform their decisions with it. So you need, reliable sources, process integration, so it's going to actually be integrated, as I mentioned earlier. And then you want diversity and volume. You don't want to have little narrow perspectives based on, oh, I heard one thing one time. You want to have enough volume to be able to say, okay, this is an actual trend. And you want enough diversity of information to make sure that you're not biased towards, hey, all we have is network data, so we have no idea what kind of identities are being stolen and reused. Well, that's not good. You need to have diversity and volume to make sure it's actual good context. And so when an organization builds a threat intelligence program, there's a couple different things. This is very much based on our own learnings as we built our own internal threat intelligence program at Microsoft for informing our own leaders, engineers, et cetera. The one thing that's actually a little different because it wasn't available at the time that we started doing this was as much as possible favor integrated technical threat intelligence. You don't want to have to wire it in yourself. The more that you have to do the work on that, the more you have to maintain it, the more you have to check the sources, etc. If you've got something like the Microsoft tooling, and I think CrowdStrike and a number of others build theirs in there, I think a whole bunch of vendors do, the more that you can favor already integrated technical threat intelligence, great. You're always going to, as you get more mature, have to bring in custom feeds, per industry feeds from your ISACs, etc. But you want to make sure that you're favoring those tools to do it and not just taking a build your own, because it's very inefficient, very painful, and takes your experts off of what they are best at doing, which is tracking the actual bad guys. So very key first starting point there. In the Risk IQ, threat intelligence is integrated into Microsoft's threat intelligence system, and they're constantly looking for more ways to sort of exchange that outside-in view, the inside one, to make all of those things better. So supporting investigations tends to be the first task beyond that. When you actually start having people dedicated to threat intelligence on a part-time or full-time basis, what you soon learn as you respond to a lot of incidents, there's some things that are important for incident response that are distracting during the moment of the investigation and not a great use of your technical security analyst or SOC analyst time. So building incident timelines, building a common operating picture, managing the IOCs, researching things. Hey, can you go and see if this IOC is anywhere else while I go and track the next bits in the log? Like, you need to have a slightly different, very adjacent, very close function, kind of close support with that intelligence. So that tends to be where threat intelligence starts. And then, ideally, mature into these threat summary reports that have a nice, simple summary of this is the attack, this is what happens, these are our recommendations for ways that we think could mitigate it, and then feed that into the architects and engineering, etc., to go ahead and start working on those mitigations. So it's really important to have that really simple view that can inform those technical folks and business leaders. Like, hey, we just missed a bullet. This is a big one. We got lucky here. We need to invest because they're going to learn to get around the thing we got lucky with this time. So really having that perspective to have those conversations with technical business leaders, CIOs, CISOs, business leaders, it's really key to have that baseline. And then, of course, as you build up more and more of these in more of a library, you need to have a platform to manage it, to manage the IOCs, the threat summary reports, and all these for the internal attacks. When you research the external ones, you need a place to put them so everybody can look them up. And hey, do you have something on that, blah, blah, blah thing that just happened? Yeah, we have a whole rundown on that. Great. And so, the more that you have that threat intelligence platform, you have to manage it. And then, ideally, and this is, usually something many years later, is you can get into that much more proactive stance where you're doing research initiatives before you see an attack to see, is there anything going on that might actually be this attack, and kind of working with the hunt team closely. And so sometimes that does happen, but this is sort of the evolution of a program that we've seen. So closing it up here. Ultimately, security is being rocked by those three different forces: that dynamic business environment and the digital transformation, a complex technical state with that legacy that just won't go away, 30 years old and counting, this hybrid of everything across IT, IoT, hybrid, multi-cloud, and it's always changing. You got the DevOps, the infrastructure as code, the automation, and all the new cloud platform features for IT and for security that are constantly changing. And so it's really, really challenging to manage that. And then, of course, the security threats. They're not only growing in business impact as they're learning new techniques to get money, of extortion, attacks like ransomware, because ransomware is an extortion attack. I'm just, and they do it a lot. And ransomware isn't pure ransomware anymore. They extort you from many different things. I'll release your data. I won't give you the key. I will reach out to your customers and clients and whatnot. So, there's a lot of business impacting growth. There's also, of course, always new attack techniques coming out. And then, within, minutes, hours, sometimes months or years, those become commodity attacks, and they become something available in the as-a-service kits, in the ransomware kits, and all these other as-a-service models. And so security's hard, right? And so the important thing that we've learned, kind of the guiding piece of this, is we want to modernize and simplify. And when we say simplify, it's a naturally complex environment. What we're doing is we're simplifying what the humans experience, the security folks, the IT folks, the business folks. We want to simplify that experience. We want to automate as much of the stuff in the background away. So we got to align to business and IT to understand what's important. We've got to transform the teams to take advantage of all these new innovations, the threat intelligence, the privilege creep analysis, all that kind of stuff, the posture management tools, you name it. Let's go ahead and, hey, we have this great new tool. It's going to help us. Let's get someone assigned to that and get that assigned to a team and understand that. And Microsoft's working on some guidance. I'm actually working to build that to sort of give a much more prescriptive set of, here's the teams, here's the tools they use, etc. Not out yet, but we're working on that problem. Simplifying the architecture, the configuration, the tech portfolio, and the user experience. We want to simplify as much as possible so that we don't end up creating more complexity than we need. And then continuous improvement. Like, we've got to be on the stance that we're not expecting perfection a day. We're not designing something for 8 months that we're going to then release at that point in time and hope it works. We're going to make incremental progress. Incremental progress over deferred perfection. I love that quote that I got from a customer. And again, driving all under those principles, those zero trust principles of assuming breach or assuming compromise, explicitly verifying, and least privilege access. And so with that, I thank you for your time, and I think you're going to really enjoy what you got coming.
Thank you, Mark. I always appreciate learning more from your great diagrams and your approach to zero trust. Next, I would like to introduce Mike Ravio. He's a global black belt. He's a specialist in cloud identity and title management. And Mike's going to provide us an overview of how CloudKnox is going to enhance our zero trust approach. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. This is Mike Rago, a global black belt with Microsoft. And I'm here to cover this particular section, which is Introduction to CIEM for Zero Trust. When talking about cloud infrastructure entitlements management, or CIEM, is really kind of figuring out where in your strategy does all of this fit in the context of permissions management. In the flow here in thinking about building secure apps, managing your security posture, defending against threats, and then enforcing the right access controls, the CloudKnox CIEM actually fits within the ability, of course, to manage and control access within your multi-cloud environment and managing that security. And so based on that, we've created a unified permissions management platform that can help you manage that across your multi-cloud architectures, which may include AWS, Azure, GCP or Google Cloud, and more. And what this allows you to really do is leverage a new ability we refer to as activity monitoring. And by doing this activity-based authorization, understanding the activity that is happening in your clouds to understand what permissions are being used and what tasks are being performed results in what we've patented, which is the activity-based authorization. Essentially allowing you to compare and contrast where people traditionally look at this, which is the permissions granted, and try to compare that to security baseline. We've now added a second ingredient to that, which is looking at the activity. So now you can look at your permissions management from a whole new lens and compare the permissions granted and now compare that to the activity you actually see or the permissions being used. So by comparing the permissions granted to the permissions used, will help identify those identities that are using far less permissions than have actually been allocated. For example, you may have an identity that's been allocated all 11,000 permissions in Azure, but is really only observed using 10 of those permissions. So now you can leverage the product to gain that visibility and also use that later on for getting to least privileges. So this brings a whole new level of visibility by bringing this multi-dimensional permissions granted where people normally look, but also the permissions used to really help manage your permissions risk. We accomplish this by incorporating something we call a permission creep index, a scoring system that allows you to really determine what that risk is and really quantify it. So now what we do is we look at every identity and what permissions have been granted versus the permissions they're actually using. And if that tends to be far less than 5%, you'll result in identities with a high risk score on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the worst in terms of very over permissioned. And then we score that for each and every identity across your subscriptions, your projects, and your accounts to roll that up and understand that across your entire infrastructures, across multi-cloud. And then we actually start to map that in more detail to risk to help uncover inactive users or those users using 0 permissions, which is something that can be really important for identity governance folks, where they may want to understand those users that need to be removed. While identity governance may incorporate human resources processes that say, hey, an individual is leaving a company and an admin then needs to remove that access and decommission that user, there may be other reasons in which you have users using 0 permissions. This may be a result of old vendor testing, and you may have created 1 or more accounts that never got removed. It may be working with a consulting firm that you no longer have a business relationship with. Or it may be part of the joiner mover leaver process where maybe someone has moved into a different role within the organization and is simply no longer using that cloud access. So we can uncover those by looking at activity and understanding who's using 0 permissions or when any of those identities have become inactive. Secondly, we can also look at over-permissioned access and really distinguish what permissions are being used versus what's been granted. Thirdly, we can look at things such as separation of duties. So for compliance, if you need to understand who has super user access, we look at the subset of those permissions for each of those respective clouds to understand who has that level of access. Within AWS, you have roughly 11,000 permissions, 5,000 of which provide admin level access. We look at those to help you uncover those. Same thing for Azure. Roughly 3,700 of the permissions within Azure of the 11,000 provide admin access. We'll help you uncover those as well, and similarly for GCP. All of this then rolls up into reporting later on, which we'll cover when we get into the deep dive sessions on day 3. We can also help in terms of remediation. So it's great that you have all this visibility and then uncover all of this risk, but how do you fix all of that? So we can automate how you can go about least privilege. In other words, we have an easy 3-step process that's very automated that essentially can most fundamentally remove all the unused permissions and help you really get to least privileges. This can incorporate removing the excessive permissions or super admin type permissions as well. So you can simply select a user, a group, a role, an app, and more, and least privilege using any of those flows. We then balance that as part of your life cycle with how you can provide access. Many organizations today have embraced just-in-time access and permissions on demand, but we add a new ingredient there as well called a template. Traditionally, people will bucketize permissions within a role. And that may have been created using kind of guesswork and some tribal knowledge. But now that we have some analytical type of data that we can say really shows what permissions people are using when they assume that role, we can least privilege that and use that to create a template and give it a user-friendly name. So now when people need additional permissions, we can actually incorporate that too. And this provides the ability for permissions on demand in a very clean and usable type of way. We also incorporate monitoring. So there are 4 key ingredients we have here. One is visibility. Second is map to risk. Third is the ability to remediate. Fourthly, we can then provide the ability to monitor the environment and alert on various types of risks. There are 2 facets to how we do the monitoring and alerting. One is leveraging our machine learning to identify anomalistic type of events. In other words, if I baseline what every identity is doing over time, I can see huge deviations in those behaviors. And that's essentially what we do within the CloudKnox permissions management product. So if you have a particular individual who is only using 10 permissions and we see a huge uptick in a few minutes that shows suddenly they're using 1,500 new permissions, you can get an alert for that. Other deviations may be suddenly accessing a whole bunch of new resources or a strange time of the day we've never observed that user performing activities. We then also complement that with custom alert triggers. So you can define your own alert triggers by selecting your cloud platform, 1 or more accounts, projects, or subscriptions, and choose from individual permissions or tasks, and use that to create alerts for things like insider threat, SolarWinds, Nobelium, and many other types of risks and threats. In fact, we provide an entire playbook that shows you how to set up many of these common types of alerts. And this certainly is focused on really helping in terms of pinpointing when a particular event may have occurred and help really fast track that investigation and ultimately the remediation as well. This plays into broader strategies for organizations, in that many organizations may have identity governance and/or PAM deployed today, and where does CIEM really play into that? So cloud infrastructure entitlements management can really help with identity governance. As we mentioned earlier, many organizations may have a blind spot in terms of multi-cloud. So the CIEM solution provides you that ability to gain those insights into that multi-cloud in terms of where permissions risks exist. rather than have to conduct manual reviews quarterly or annually or on an ongoing basis. We can now inform identity governance folks in the form of reports and even alerts of when something becomes dormant, when a user is suddenly using super user permissions, or in a very baked and canned type of report, provide that in the form of their quarterly reporting and even tagging features we have in the product for exclusions. This also helps in terms of privilege clipping. So in terms of remediating, if you're using a particular IGA solution, how do you do this in the cloud where you may say, gee, I see over permissioned access. I see people with super admin type permissions. How do I fix that? Well, as we've mentioned, within the CloudKnox permissions management, that's already incorporated in the product. You can use that as part of your IGA flow. And then for privileged access management, there are various aspects of determining how do I, really incubate what that is going to be configured. In other words, how do I create those roles that people may assume that give various permissions? And when I created that originally, and I did that manually, how close was I to what people are actually using? As we've mentioned with the CloudKnox permissions management, when you incubate those roles, you can now do that using least privileges based on the analytics from CloudKnox permissions management. So it will help better control that over permissioned access, get to least privileges, and help you incubate or adjust those roles much better. And this will also help in terms of your broader strategy too, in bringing all three of these elements together. We have integrations that are going on. And when you think about Microsoft Defender for Cloud and where does this play in, there are a variety of elements and security components that will now be incorporated into Microsoft Defender for Cloud across CSPM, across CWPP, and now CIEM to really complete that CNAP overview and umbrella that encompasses those three areas. So now you'll have the trifecta of those three that give you that ability across all of those. Secondly, we have always had the ability to send alerts to Sentinel, but now we'll be enhancing that. And so whether it be Sentinel or another SIM product that you may have, provide the ability across this with additional multi-cloud activity, analytics, and alerting across SIM, SOC, and SOAR. And then thirdly, for your identity protection, leverage all of your multi-cloud context for all this identity threat detection. So now if there are particular risks identified, not only within Azure, but maybe within AWS or within GCP, you can incorporate that as well as part of your identity protection. So appreciate you attending this session. As we mentioned on day 3, we'll have 7 different sessions where we'll dive deep into everything from visibility to remediation to just-in-time access to alerting and monitoring. But in addition to that, we'll get into aspects of operationalization, troubleshooting, and more across CloudKnox permissions management. So we look forward to seeing you in those sessions as well. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Mike. Next up, I'd like to introduce Brad Guzzi, Senior Business Strategy Manager, working directly with our partners. Brad's going to discuss the partner opportunity for the Microsoft Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management Solution. Over to you, Brad.
Hello, folks. My name is Brad Guzzi, and I'm on the Security Partner Development Team here at Microsoft. Our team specializes in bringing what we call incubation loads to the market. Essentially, technologies that Microsoft acquires land within our group, and we help to shape those technologies and bring them to partners like you folks that are on here today. And we'll help with things like go-to-market, forecasting, things of that nature. And we'll even get into things like helping you with building technologies too, like integrations. We work with 2 separate teams as well. The GBP team, that's the Global Black Belt team. You may have met Mike Rago earlier. He's on that team. And they're also responsible for help with selling of the CloudKnox technology, or Microsoft Keem, as we're calling it now. Another team that you will get familiar with is the iDNA CXP team. The Identity and Access Experience team is essentially a post-sales team, but they will help you to build integrations for your clients. So together, the three teams, again, the security partner team that I'm on, the iDNA CXP team, and the GBB team, we all come together to help support the solution now known as Microsoft Keem, or Cloud Infrastructure Entitlements Management. So let's get right to it. First, I'm going to talk to you about how you can actually engage as a partner with your clients. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about actual challenges within Keem. Then I'll move on to discussing the risk assessment, which is a great tool that you can use and bring to your clients. And you actually might want to use that internally as well. Some of our partners have actually chosen to deploy the product internally based on size of their organization and the fact that they'd like to get more protection within their multi-cloud environments. And then finally, I'll share a really cool services strategy slide. Built this with my former VP, Dave Hawk, based out in Colorado. And the reason I mention that is living out west, Dave has a great saying, and that is that the cloud is the Wild West. So just wanted to give a shout out to Dave on that. So let's jump right into it. How do partners engage around solutions in Keem today? This is a slide that our sales team actually uses as well when they're meeting with clients, but as a partner, you're certainly welcome as well to present something like this to a potential client. This is a list of artifacts that a solution like CloudKnox can actually help you to uncover. This is just a sample set, but it's really kind of brings to light what is out there. And I challenge you to ask your clients, how are you capturing this information today? How do you know what over-provisioned or active identities you have today, right? How do you find inactive groups, right? Groups that can access secrets managers, but even more so, up in that top center, identities that have super admin privileges. This is a big one. In fact, we've challenged some of our clients to date and asked them, well, how many super admins do you think you have? And quite commonly, the answer might be, oh, we have 20 to 30 super admins. Well, we came back after doing an assessment in just 24 hours with the numbers that are more like 100 or 200 super admins. And there's typically a little bit of, oh, wow, we didn't realize we had that many super admins, and what can we do about that? And other things too, like guard duty and key management too. We actually have an ability to help you or your clients with management of keys and inactive keys, things of that nature. So next, I'm going to help to build out a really fun slide that we put together back in the CloudKnox days, and I think it really helps to kind of understand the problem statement out there, and really why Balaji brought the technology like Keem to market. So let's talk about some of those challenges and really what Balaji saw and what his vision was to basically provide a solution for. So as you look across all of these clouds today, and I'm talking about not just Azure, but of course GCP, AWS, and even VMware's vSphere product, which we also supported. You look at modern infrastructure today, and yes, it's brought great benefits to organizations, but inadvertently, it's created a new attack surface that quite frankly did not exist 5 years ago. With that attack surface is your 50,000 plus permissions across clouds, and know that that grows like a carbon life form. I'll steal that phrase from my favorite GBB, or one of my favorite GBBs, Mike Rago, who you met earlier. And I promise you'll spend some great time with when we move into day 3, which is the deep dive on CloudKnox. So again, we look at these 50,000 permissions today, And when we look at these, we realize that greater than half of these are high risk because they could cause catastrophic damage if used improperly. Let me give you an example of that. A bank, I'll say maybe a couple years ago, was in the news. That bank was using AWS. And within that, somebody had actual user credentials, right? Typically, if you think about it, all hacks are done with valid credentials, right? A user took their AWS credentials, got into an instance, and from that instance went to an EC2 bucket, right? Now think about this. You've got a human that's now taken over a machine. So keep that in mind because this technology supports both human and non-human entities. So this individual, this bad actor, was able to get into an EC2 instance, and from there jumped over to another EC2 bucket, if you will. And within that bucket was 100 million credit card applications, and that individual chose to actually download those. And that's a place where that machine should not have had permissions to go. So a lot of you may know the institution I'm talking about. I won't share the name, but a perfect example of not right-sizing identities within the cloud and allowing someone to go jumping from an instance to an EC2 bucket and just like that pulling down an immense amount of data and causing quite a fine relative to the breach. We look at AWS, and alone that has over 200 services, 18,000 permissions. But what's interesting when you look at AWS is that over 5,000 of these permissions can grant admin level access, right? And so in thinking about that, now you've got a great percentage of these that are right back up there with admin level access, right? I mean, would you recommend to a client that they could allow any user to change a firewall policy? Probably not. And that's why essentially what's existing today is that with these super admin policies or admin level, is users are able to actually do that. So when we looked at, if we're looking further down into the details here, greater than 90% of these privileged identities are grossly over-provisioned, which means they could adversely impact the infrastructure, right? So we looked at the findings. We did over 100 risk assessments. And when you look at these, less than 5% of permissions granted are actually used. So you see on the left-hand side is I've painted up a little bit of a chart here or a graph. And quite simply, it's permissions granted versus permissions used. So again, getting back to that less than 5%, that number is probably a little bit closer to 2%. And let me share some real numbers with you. We had a particular client that we went to do a risk assessment for, and we pulled up a subset of their users. And typically a user will have access to, let's say, maybe 100 services or permissions. Those users, in fact, when you take a look at the tool and the findings, they'll typically have access to 8,000 or 9,000 permissions, right? So they're using 100, access to 8,000 or 9,000, right? That's why I say the less than 5% is really closer to 1 or 2%, but we'll use 5 based on some of the findings that we had out there. So again, this delta gap, this dangerous delta is what's called the cloud permissions gap. And when we score that within our platform, you'll hear a term called PCI. PCI is Privilege Creep Index. You may have heard that earlier in the call, but that's how we model it, as a PCI score, not to be confused with the Privacy Information Act. And so, in a nutshell, the CloudNux platform will provide 3 key initiatives here. Visibility, which we already talked to, right? You got to be able to see all those permissions and identities and see who's using what. But foremost, you must also be able to provide remediation. If you look across some of the other products in our space, or perhaps some of the PIM-PAM solutions out there, a lot of these can do visibility as well. However, these products don't typically remediate, and they certainly don't do it in the cloud. Remediation for us is actually, in some cases, rewriting the script so we can actually kick out some JSON, and this is where you'll actually use the tool set to actually create a new set of policies or rules, permissions that allow a user to just get enough of what they typically use, right? Build that as a baseline for the permissions, and then block the rest, right? Now, what happens if somebody needs something outside of that new rule or that new permission you created, right? Perhaps Mike had access to these. We've now shrunken Mike down to these 100 permissions, and in doing so, maybe he needs access to something over the weekend, a database or something. Well, the toolset can also provide that through the just-in-time permissioning and on-demand. And think about integrations like ServiceNow. That's a perfect example of how you could perform an action like that. ServiceNow, that individual could go in there, request through the ticketing system in ServiceNow access to that database, and maybe he just needs that on Saturday mornings from 10 to 11. That can be time-based, granted for that user, and from there, once he's done performing those actions and that window closes, that permission is now taken away. And this is another perfect example of what we see or find when we do these assessments with our clients, is that in many cases, these developers, these third-party contractors, or perhaps even retired employees still have access to these cloud services. And then finally, monitoring, right? Continuously monitor the activity, be able to provide alerts on anomalies, right? We're seeing logins in countries where we're not even operating today. That's an anomaly. Mike will give you a much greater deep dive on these on day 3 when he'll actually show you how we actually do this within the console and provide much greater detail. But I just wanted to kind of let you know this is some of the tooling that's available today within the console. So let's talk about the risk assessment. The CloudKnox risk assessment is no cost, right? It's free to you as a partner and to your clients. But what's really unique is that we built this to not be, a heavy, burdensome install, right? The CloudKnox platform can be installed in many cases in under 30 minutes. I'll pick on another one of our clients, a big pharma on the East Coast, had services in all 3 of the public clouds I mentioned before, Azure, AWS, and GCP. We were able to install, in that time, we were installing a Sentry in each one of those clouds. We've moved that technology now to be embedded inside of Azure and AAD. So what that means now is the system will essentially pull data right from your Azure tenant, and through that, we can actually collect the same data from AWS and GCP. So we no longer require that Sentry infrastructure or technology that we used before relative to the architecture, So you're able now to get this running in sometimes less than an hour. And now this is not a product that you'll run for 90 days. In fact, it can be run for 24 hours, maybe 48. In that collection time, you will actually be able to pull back 90 days of data. See who did what, who went where, how were those permissions granted to that individual, to that group, how was that role created. This can all be uncovered in about 24 to 48 hours, as I mentioned. And from there, why not bring a detailed report to the executive team of your client and show them just how over-permissioned they might be. And finally, a services slide that we put together based on a survey of quite a number of our partners back in the CloudKnox days, many of which are now Microsoft partners. So it's great. We've had a lot of the folks that were working with our identity tool before, and we come over to Microsoft and learn that many of you are still here. So great to see many of you back again. So this set of pillars here around engage, deploy, transformation, and operationalizing, right? This could be quite a different look to many of you here. You can mix and match the pillars. Many of the items within the pillars may sit in a different bucket within your organization. But to kind of help you understand a little baseline here is that with this here, we'll start with Engage, right? And know that Microsoft partners are able to take advantage of our ESIF program here, which does provide planning dollars for your end customers. So please do inquire about our ESIF program if you haven't taken advantage of that before. Back to Engage though, right? This is all about looking, installing the assessment here and really putting together some guidelines about the risk assessment findings. And first and foremost, of course, planning out how to strategize on access control, how to talk about their PAM and IGA solutions. That third bullet on compliance too, that brings up another story too. We had a client that was a major utility on the East Coast. That particular client, being a utility, had to conform to compliance reporting. They told us that when they installed our tool that we literally saved them close to 6 months of prep work specific to that compliance based on the reporting that our tooling can do. So that's all part of Engage. Now deploy the fun stuff, right? Get it installed and configured. You saw on the RA slide, this can be done in 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. It depends on ruling, of all rules. But here's where you're going to get to work. And for you GSIs out there, use case definition, policy framework. I know that's music to your ears. Here's where you'll do your integrations with PAM solutions and IGA solutions. Know that more than 90% of our clients actually use SailPoint. So many may think that that's a competitive product, but in fact, most of our clients actually use it. And as if you recall, Balaji mentioned that the data we collect can be sent back to products or solutions like a SailPoint, and you're able to do things like recertification, and there are many other use cases as well. Over on the transformation side, here's where you implement anomaly detection and that actual remediation, right? What happens once we remediate someone? Do they get the permissions back? Define who's responsible for these permissions and roles, and really get into defining the infrastructure, custom security, and even compliance controls. And then finally, automation, right? Automation, key word here, right? If you can get all these policies automated, then you're going to greatly enhance your client's ability to limit those over-permissioned identities. And of course, integration with ITSM products. You heard me mention before, ServiceNow. Know that the product set will be integrated with Sentinel and Defender for Cloud over here at Microsoft. So that's on our roadmap. We hope to deliver those soon. And finally, operationalizing the product, right? Ongoing change management within your clients, right? Runbook. How about performing those health checks, right? So again, I won't read everything here, but just a sample set of some of the items that you hopefully can bring to your clients out there. This is, again, really what's out there relative to strategy available. And we want to thank the partners that helped us to build this, right? Hopefully many SOWs become of this as you present this to your partners today or in the future. I do want to thank you on behalf of my team, the Security Partner Development team. Additionally, the ID and ACXP team, any of you folks out there that know Anchor or Shaker, and the GBB team, right? Some of those are former CloudNox SEs, and they've joined forces of the Microsoft GBB team. And those are the folks that are going to help you to get your RAs going, help you to quote and move the product along to your clients in conjunction with the Microsoft sellers. So I thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. I'm sure all of our partners are going to get in touch soon to learn more. Now we're going to take a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we'll hear more about the Risk IQ solution. See you soon. Hey, I hope you had a good break. Next up, I'd like to introduce Scott Woodgate, Senior Director from Microsoft Security, with an introduction to the external attack surface management and threat intelligence. Over to you, Scott.
Hi, everyone. In this session, we'll talk to Risk IQ's threat intelligence and the external attack surface management technologies. So let's dive on in. Now, typically I'd start a presentation with a customer problem, but before I do that, I really want to center on the core technology that Microsoft acquired from Risk IQ, and then we'll apply it to these two customer problems of threat intelligence and external attack surface management. Fundamentally, at its heart and soul, Risk IQ's core IP is an incredibly amazing map of the internet and all of the threat intelligence associated with the internet. And so what Risk IQ does is on a kind of real-time basis, or several times a day, scans the entire internet and builds a database, a massive database of more than 10 petabytes of internet intelligence. And with that security intelligence, there are more than 15 billion observations. And so it literally does that by working through all the IP addresses of the internet and collecting that, is including not just the IP address, but what is the infrastructure running on that IP address. And so you could imagine if you had this incredible database with all of the security intelligence of the internet and the infrastructure associated with it, what could you do with that? That's the kind of primary reason why Microsoft bought Risk IQ. And it supplements very clearly what Microsoft already had. Microsoft pre-Risk IQ, we had a lot of threat intelligence natively, we still do, that comes from a number of sources. For example, all of the threat intelligence that comes from running the world's largest clouds, whether that be Azure or Office 365 or Dynamics or Xbox. Microsoft has a more diverse set of properties than anyone else, and with that comes bad actors, and with that comes our job to protect all of those platforms, and we derive from that threat intelligence to use in our security products. The second key thing, of course, that Microsoft has from a threat intelligence perspective is agents that run, for example, on endpoints. When you run Windows Security or you run Defender for Endpoint. And so those sets of threat intelligence are what I would call inside-out threat intelligence. It's sourced from Microsoft properties or sourced from agents that are running from Microsoft. This Risk IQ database is the opposite of that. It's sourced from the entire internet, and therefore the Risk IQ technologies are extremely complementary with the capabilities that you already have in Microsoft from Defender and Sentinel. So with that, just as a quick kind of primer on what Risk IQ is, this massive database of intelligence that's sourced from the internet, let's see how you can use it inside your organization. And there's really two core scenarios we're going to focus on today. One is security posture, and the second is threat intelligence. And so if I start with security posture, and if I step back for a minute, inside your enterprise, your attack surface is dynamic and it's growing. It's dynamic because, of course, you are building applications all the time to serve your customers and your trading partners. It is growing through mergers and acquisitions, through innovation. And one of the challenges with your attack surface is it's very, very hard to understand what your attack surface is. There's no easy place to go to look at all of your public-facing IP addresses across your company. There could be a server on premises that's just sitting in somebody's cupboard. There could be a subscription that somebody swiped a credit card for on AWS. It may be that you merged and acquired a number of companies, and it's unclear how your entire attack surface looks. It could be that you have, distributed IT governance, and so you understand a piece of the puzzle, but not necessarily the whole puzzle. When it comes from an attack perspective, if you think in the mind of an attacker as opposed to a defender, as you know, the attacker is going to go find the most vulnerable spot. They don't really care whether it's, you know, an application that was swiped by a credit card or a server under a desk or some other piece of infrastructure. They'll find the most vulnerable piece of infrastructure for the way in. And yet getting this visibility is super hard. And so that's a core problem for customers. And there are technologies that can help with that problem. And they're typically in the cloud security space. And we're certainly going to talk about one today. But first, if I dive into what customers think about from a data perspective on this problem, the first is that visibility into my security is a huge priority in the cloud security world. In fact, 52% of organizations cite that securing their cloud resources is a top priority. As you know, even my grandma knows what ransomware is at this point, especially given all of the attacks that happened in 2020 and into 2021. Ransomware is an economy. There's certainly, people pay for ransomware. It will encourage folks to continue to ransom. And that wasn't a judgment call. It's just simply a purely an economic situation here where ransomware folks are out for money. And we've seen an increase as a result in attacks and the sophistication of the attacks, coincident to some degree with COVID, the pandemic, and the increased reliance on digital to continue customer and partner, operations and activities. And it's not surprising that many customers, in fact, the majority of customers, when they think about their cloud environments, are not a single cloud vendor centric. And so perhaps they're using Azure, but they're also using AWS, and they're probably using Google as well, or some combination of those three clouds. And so with that, how do you get visibility across that multi-cloud environment of AWS, GCP, and Azure? How do you get visibility in on-premises? And in fact, there's tools that enable that. In fact, we have one, which is Defender for Cloud. And what Defender for Cloud does is effectively enumerate the resources in Azure, in AWS, in GCP, in a single pane of glass. And Microsoft's actually the only of those three cloud vendors to have such a security tool that will give you security posture, not just for Azure, but also for AWS and GCP. The other folks do it just for their cloud platforms at this point. And once you get visibility into that posture, you're good, right? You have a list of virtual machines that are running in the various platforms, maybe SQL servers, Kubernetes instances, whatever it is. And with that list, you can do things like understand vulnerabilities. You can go and work on the responding to threats and automate side if you see alerts. Automate responses. You can integrate in with tools that you may already use, SIM tools, or in fact, ITSM tools like ServiceNow. So Defender for Cloud is a very important piece of security posture management. And it is easier than it used to be on premises to get visibility into the cloud resources that you know about. Defender for Cloud has to know that you have a subscription in AWS and you log it into it, or you have to, similarly in GCP or in Azure. It can't, guess the subscriptions that somebody credit card swiped. And it does work on premises. On premises is not as easy to, of course, create a list of resources because there is no global list in on-premises software like there is in the cloud to look at. So Defender for Cloud is a great tool for security posture management, but it's insufficient. It doesn't cover the use cases of an incomplete attack surface because there are many instances through mergers and acquisition or shadow IT or on-premises where you have spun up things that are not visible to Defender for Cloud because you weren't aware that they were in fact existing. And so with that comes the opportunity to supplement the capabilities in Defender for Cloud. And that's where RiskIQ's external attack surface management comes in. So using that massive database of internet information I described previously, we can then correlate that to you, your brand, your assets that are digital and facing the internet. And so we can use the outside-in approach to build a picture of all of your assets that are internet facing, and in so doing, get the complete view, not just the view that you know about, but the view that you may not know about, but is in fact internet facing, because we're not looking at the internals of the infrastructure first. We're looking at the external internet and then diving down into the infrastructure itself. And of course, if you do this capability, you can run it one time, but that's not super useful. I mean, it's not bad. But you really want continuous monitoring of these internet facing assets as things get spun up, spun down. Perhaps as a result of discovering some of these assets, you actually want to turn them off, which you can certainly do. Perhaps when you discover some of these assets, you realize that they're unprotected. Perhaps they don't have threat protection, for example, on the virtual machines on a new Apache web server that has been running on the internet for a while, but it's new to you, and it was an unauthorized resource. But you've had a discussion with the project owner in another business unit. You realize it has to continue, but you better secure it. And so you go through and then take that information into Defender for Cloud, actually. And go ahead and apply the same protections that Defender for Cloud offers for other resources to this newly discovered resource. And now you have reduced your attack surface substantially in terms of the risk because you're monitoring it with best practice security. And so that's a key capability of Risk IQ, is this notion of being able to discover assets that you wouldn't have discovered. In our own experience at Microsoft, it's very challenging to understand all of your assets in most organizations. And so when we've run this capability in most organizations, we find insecure, unknown, internet-facing assets that must be protected to ensure continued business continuity. So an extremely valuable capability that's very hard to get somewhere else. In terms of what the actual tool looks like, and I know Ben has a session a little bit later in this series that will dive into the details of this, but I'll just keep it at a high level for you. You can see here just a few of the views from the user experience. This is for a particular company. It might even be the Risk IQ company, right? We run it on Risk IQ themselves. You can see the number of IP addresses that exist. You can see the number of pages that are available to the internet from this broader organization. You can see SSL certificates. You can see domains, and so on and so on. And so you get visibility across the attack surface. You can see the number of cloud providers that are inside the organization and which assets are in which places. You might have some of those that are authorized, great. You might have some of those that are not authorized, that once again, you either shut down or protect. And of course, you can drill into the individual details of each of them. And then once you have visibility into these assets, then you can look at vulnerabilities, and you can also look at best practices to go ahead and implement to ensure that you have a very strong external attack surface. So that's a super core capability. Recommend if you're a partner, there's a real opportunity in working with your customers to ask them, do you understand your external attack surface? And through mergers and acquisitions, as well as shadow IT, as you go do that, I think you'll find that most customers do not have end-to-end visibility. And this tool applies to most customers in terms of providing them with an additional level of defense, where you can go ahead and catalog a new and unknown set of resources, protect those resources or shut them off, and you're good to go. The second core category I want to talk about today is really using if you like, the raw threat intelligence that comes in that gigantic data set I talked about itself in a security operations team capacity. And so when I think through that, just firstly grounding everybody, I'm sure if you're in SecOps, you know this well, As we look at attackers, it's always good to understand, the key aspects of attackers. Certainly, it's, there's a lot of noise in the system around zero-day attacks, but the reality is that you can do a denial of service for an incredibly small amount of money, $300 a month. Ransomware kits can cost less than $100 a month. You can see, spear phishing for hire and stolen usernames and passwords. So there is a commodity marketplace out there of cyber criminals who are working to exploit the system to effectively make money. And then there's a bunch of, on top of the commodity stuff, a bunch of human operated ransomware, where folks are in, full-time jobs, either for nation states on occasions or for criminal enterprises, who are attacking companies, governments, even small, medium businesses are not immune anymore to ransomware. And so it's super important that that you apply security best practices and you build a zero trust environment and you're verifying everything and you're really doubling down on your identity investments with things like MFA and SSO and so on. And then in addition to that, you always want to be monitoring for these attacks. You should always assume a defense in depth strategy and be on the lookout. And so, as I said before, and I'll just cover quickly with some numbers, Microsoft has an amazing volume of threat intelligence. We have well in excess of 24 trillion daily signals that are made available from our infrastructure. If you look at that, there's 9 billion threats that are blocked by our endpoint tools, or 31 billion through Active Directory on endpoint, or 32 billion in email that are blocked. So just staggeringly big numbers of threats that we get experience to and understand, codify, and put in that information into our security tools to better protect you. Now, all of this, of course, is backed by people, and so we've employed some of the cleverest folks in the world from a security perspective, not just to do the classic red-blue teaming thing on our products, but also to be protecting our platforms on a daily basis. And you've certainly seen articles where Microsoft is collaborating with law enforcement to shut down certain groups that are, not doing things to keep the world safe, to say the least. So this is a big area of focus for us, and we have, a threat intelligence knowledge that is far beyond most folks based on the massive volume of diverse signals that we collect and our ability as a well-funded company to invest, in this case, $20 billion in security over the next 5 years. So we have this gigantic volume of threat intelligence. And Risk IQ has very much added to that, complementing, as I said earlier, our inside-out view of a threat based on agents and clouds with an outside-in view based on the map of the internet. And just before I go into the product pieces, here's just one of the pieces of research that I'll highlight just super quickly. There's a document that I encourage you to read called the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. It's an annual report. It goes into considerable depth on ransomware, trends we're seeing year over year. And this year it talked about, I think, IoT is, some new and interesting attacks in the IoT space, certainly an area for folks to continue to work harder at protecting would be OT, or operational technology. It goes into nation states. This is a particular view. We characterize a set of nation state actors by various elements of the periodic table. So the SolarWinds attack is Nobelium out of Russia. And so you can see this broad set of actors, and in the Digital Defense Report, we go through and give you quite a detailed piece of information if you're curious about each of these attackers, their typical methods that they use, and so on. So I'd strongly encourage you to look at the Digital Defense Report. We also have a new Security Insights page that's very focused on threat intelligence, and certainly you'll see us continuing to push in the press and other places as we raise awareness on some of these threats to help make the world safe. So with all of that massive volume of threat intelligence, all of that plays into our products or our tools that security operations teams use to protect systems. And that would be the Sentinel and Defender ecosystem of products. These are what we call our SIM tools. SIM tools have been around for a long time, involve taking a large volume of security logs from literally every system that you can get data into. So this is definitely not just the Microsoft systems. This is pulling information from competitive security tools like, I don't know, Palo or whomever else. And it's pulling data from applications like, I don't know, SAP, and it's pulling data from all the platforms and all the clouds. And so Sentinel is our cloud native SIM tool. It's the SecOps command and control experience and gives you visibility end to end across your organization. Now, SIM tools are great and they work with a lot of logs, and then they actually, in our case, correlate incidents with AI on top of it. And so for ransomware, it's super important to be able to see not just the endpoint. In fact, that's really insufficient just to have EDR, but also to have identity and also to have cloud app coverage and SQL servers and the whole lot. And so Sentinel can build you a kill chain from a real live incident, showing you that thread of the attacker as they move laterally across your system in a graphical view. And of course, you can also query using KQL, which is our query language, do custom detections and so on. And this is not a Sentinel presentation, but I'm just giving you a flavor of it. And feeding into Sentinel, we have XDR, and Microsoft's actually one of a very small number of companies that has both a SIM tool and a set of XDR tools. XDR tools are where SIM tools are comprehensive. XDR tools are deep on knowledge of specific resources. And so we have two XDR tools, one for our end user environments and one for our cloud infrastructure. And these have incredibly deep understanding of, for example, attacks on Android or attacks on iOS or attacks on Mac or Windows or attacks on Linux, AWS, GCP, and so on. And so the essence of an XDR is to have a very deep understanding of a specific resource. This SQL server, cross-site scripting might be a thing that ends up happening on a website. Attacks on SQL Server through query-based attacks. Attacks on management ports on servers. And so with this XDR capability in Microsoft 365 Defender and Defender for Cloud, we generate alerts and then create incidents for them scoped to either the infrastructure or the end users. And then that information is fed into Sentinel, and it's far more refined than just raw logs. And what that means is the SecOps teams that have been used to getting an incredible amount of false positives in an absolute sea of data now don't have nearly as much of that as an issue, as they can piece together an incident with high fidelity data that has been prioritized by AI and enables the team to go, do what is the important job, which is evicting bad actors, as opposed to spending time wasted on false positives. And we see that in the data of Sentinel. And as you would expect, when you create an incident in Sentinel, that incident is visible in Microsoft 365 Defender or Defender for Cloud. You can open it in Sentinel, close it in Defender for Cloud, and so on. So there's a red thread or a context that exists across all three of these products, which is really a big win for SecOps and is very different to what security teams are often used to, where perhaps you have an EDR and perhaps you have identity threat protection and perhaps you have something to protect your cloud. But it takes a person to glue together how all those pieces work, and it's really hard to do that and find things today, especially ransomware. So we move beyond that and enable you to do that through the use of AI and shared incidents. So how do those things come together? Well, fundamentally, underneath all of those products, of course, is our AI, and is our TI, and we make our best TI available to our products all the time. We don't hold back any TI for our products. You buy the products. If there is an incident that happens, we will match that incident against all of our TI, including nation states as well as vulnerabilities, the whole shebang. Risk IQ takes that base of TI to the next level in terms of product matching, but then it also has a separate capability. You can think of this as a dashboard or a workspace for the threat intelligence professional, for the security operations professional, to get deeper understanding, deeper contextual understanding of a particular threat. And so what this portal-based experience does is effectively share with you the raw threat intelligence of any particular attacker. And so, for example, perhaps you have an IP address, you can see an IP address here that looks suspicious. You can go take that IP address in the workbench that is the Risk IQ portal, and it will tell you that actually that IP address that you thought was suspicious is owned by an attacker. For purposes of illustration, maybe it was the Cobalt Strike attack group. It will also tell you the infrastructure that's being used on that IP address. You know, there'll be a certain type of SSL certificate that Cobalt Strike uses, a certain set of web-based capabilities they use. We'll be able to see that as well. You've found one IP address that is attacking you, but of course many of these groups use more than a single IP address to attack your organization, and we will have mapped out perhaps another 5 IP addresses that are Cobalt Strike servers. You obviously want to quickly go into your firewall, turn off this IP address, turn off the other 5, and then work on, working through the rest of the lateral damage, if any has happened from the attacker, resetting identities and so on. So this is an extremely powerful database of threat intelligence. It's an encyclopedia or a LexisNexis of threat intelligence information. It's sourced from 50 different sources, including a bunch of proxies around the world. It's literally trillions of real-time observations. It is updated on a regular basis, multiple times a day. And it is an incredible asset for the security operations teams in your time of need when you are working through a live incident. In fact, before we purchased Risk IQ, I sat down with our own security operations teams. We were a customer of Risk IQ before we bought Risk IQ. And this was one of their favorite tools. In fact, my SecOps team said, you should buy this company. This tool is fantastic, and I use it every day so that I can understand my adversary and work it through. And so this is a really important tool to consider. In addition to your E5 security and your Sentinel, supplement both of those with Risk IQ. And you have threat intelligence capabilities that are really awesome at giving your security operations teams visibility from attackers and working it through. There's a couple of other things you can do. Of course, you can do cyber threat intelligence if you want, adversary fingerprinting, and so on. So you can really understand through indicators even more details of organizations and bring them together. You can do third-party intelligence, and so you can extend beyond your attack surface and look at the digital footprint of others and understand your supply chain to a greater deal than you did before. And of course, the Risk IQ capability, as you might guess, is deeply integrated with both our Defender sets and our Sentinel sets. As we start today with Sentinel, there is a Sentinel connector. I believe it'll be a taxi connector at some point. But anyway, today there's a Sentinel connector that flows that TI directly into Sentinel. And you can build your own orchestration pipelines using the Risk IQ. It's called the Flow connector, as well as the automation capabilities in Sentinel we call Microsoft Logic apps. So this is a great partner for Sentinel. I would encourage any customer who is considering purchasing E5 security and Sentinel to purchase Risk IQ's threat intelligence for your team. So in summary, the Risk IQ capabilities are really in 2 core areas. The first is in external attack surface management. Do you really know what your external attack surface is? This is a phenomenal tool that will give you an outside-in view, will give you the visibility into shadow IT, will give you the visibility into servers you just didn't know exist. and then we'll give you the opportunity to either secure those or shut them down with full lifecycle management capabilities when included with Defender for Cloud. And then on the TI side, there's a really strong capability here for your SecOps teams and detect and respond to really more deeply understand the adversary. As an aside, RiskIQ TI, there's a free community edition that's available. It's more limited, as you'd imagine, but it's a great place to start. If you haven't seen that, then sign up for it. There's a community of more than 100,000 folks using the community edition, and it's certainly, you know, something that we want to continue. As we move forward with Microsoft and RiskIQ, stay tuned for more exciting news. You know, we purchased RiskIQ in September or so, and so we're 5 or 6 months in now. But you can expect that we're going to continue to be innovating in this product and technology space. You can expect that we're going to continue to integrate even more deeply with our Defender and Sentinel toolsets. And so, thanks, folks. I appreciate your attention. And have a great day.
Thank you, Scott. Some very interesting capabilities in there. You know, I think one of the things I picked up on is just, I'm always surprised by the research that you show on the slide of, you know, just how much it costs to attack someone. When I first saw that, I saw that you can do a denial of service for $300 a month or email attacks for $25 a month. It just makes it more accessible for almost any attacker to do what they want to do. So now I'm going to turn it back over to our regional leads. Thank you, and I will see you again tomorrow.